He woke up early that day with that mix of anxiety and hope that only those who have dreamed of turning their life around know well. He put on his best shirt, carefully ironed by his mother, and practiced his smile in front of the mirror. It wasn't just a job, it was the promise of finally getting out of hardship. But as soon as he walked through the company's revolving door, the air changed. The silence in the hallways carried the scent of judgment. The doorman didn't even ask his name, simply pointed to the back and said, "Cleaning starts at 8. He took a deep breath, swallowing that comment like someone swallowing a dry thorn. For many there, the color of his skin was an invisible resume, one that was read before his voice could even be heard. Still, he kept his smile like a shield. Against the world, the receptionist, with red nails and a sharp gaze, asked if he was there for maintenance work. When he explained he was there for the administrative department, her eyebrow arched in surprise. That small gesture hurt more than a slap. Some smiles are not a welcome, they are a test, meant to see how much someone can endure in the induction room. The glances that swept him from head to toe had already made their judgment. It's curious how certain people look at someone as if they were trespassing in their backyard. Inside, the question echoed, will I ever just be me without having to prove I deserve to be here? On the outside, he kept his posture firm, like a player stepping onto the field already knowing the opposing crowd is booing. During the coffee break, he tried to start a conversation, but the reply came short and dry, as if words had been rationed, to save sympathy. He was the new guy, but it wasn't just that. Sometimes the silence of a group speaks louder than any insult. And there, the silence screamed. When the manager came by to give his welcome, he shook his hand with the same energy used for someone you've already decided not to like. There was no interest in hearing his story, only a mechanical formality. The body senses it before the mind when a place doesn't want your presence. At the end of the day, walking down the halls, he heard muffled laughter behind a door. Instinct told him it was about him, but he kept walking, pretending it wasn't. It's a survival trick. Keep smiling so the world doesn't see the damage inside. On the way home, the street wind felt colder. Even so, he kept telling himself he had to stay strong. He had faced other battles before, and maybe without knowing it, this would be the longest of them all. This war would not be won with effort alone, but also with resilience. That night, lying in bed, his clothes still smelling of paper and air conditioning, he realized that place was a stage, and he would have to perform to survive. It wasn't the job itself that scared him, but the audience, and the question lingered. If it already started like this, how far would it go? If you want to follow this story and learn from every detail, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications, because what comes next will shake you even more. Eurymius arrived early and left late, as if every extra minute was his way of proving he deserved to be there. He did more than what was asked, solving problems that weren't even in his area, while many were content to do the bare minimum. He treated every task as if it were the chance to change the course of his story. But at the end of the day, it was as if his presence was still invisible. In meetings, he sat with perfect posture, ready to contribute. But when he spoke, it was as if his words fell into a bottomless well. His ideas disappeared into thin air. Until days later, they were repeated by others, with the credit going to different names. It's a bitter feeling to see your work shine on someone else's resume. Even so, he didn't complain. He knew that in places like that, speaking out too much could come at a price. He chose to work in silence, keeping in his heart the certainty that talent doesn't have to shout, though sometimes it must know how to defend itself. At that moment, though, it was still too early for counterattacks. One time, he presented a solution that would save the team days of work. He received cold stares, curt comments, and later watched a colleague receive praise for the same proposal, repackaged with different words. Injustice wasn't new, but it hurt every time, as if it were the first. The veiled comments came. One day, a superior, laughing, said, "You speak almost too well. I almost forget you're black." The room laughed. Eurymius laughed too, but it was the kind of laugh born not from joy, but from self-protection. Later in the bathroom, the laughter turned into heavy silence. Still, he kept his discipline. It wasn't for the boss, it wasn't for the company, it was for himself. Every report delivered with excellence, every task completed with care, was a silent promise that the world would one day hear his name, hear it loudly. Deep down, Jeremias knew that even if he remained invisible to them, he was building something valuable: experience, resilience, and a standard of excellence no one could steal. It's like sharpening a sword without the enemy noticing. The cut will come at the right time. The weight of indifference was constant, but he clung to the idea that every seed, sooner or later, finds the light. Perhaps this was just the winter. Before the harvest, and if the winter was cold, Jeremias was willing to endure it. Jeremias had already learned that, in that environment, any word could be twisted. All it took was politely disagreeing to be labeled aggressive. What for others was assertiveness, for him became a threat, no matter how careful his tone. The weight placed on his words didn't come from their sound, but from the color of the skin that spoke them. At lunch, he would approach tables where laughter flowed freely. But as soon as he sat down, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations ended abruptly. Cutlery clinked nervously, and suddenly everyone remembered urgent commitments. His adulation came disguised as coincidence. Once the company organized an internal party, Jeremias, dressed as elegantly as always, was stopped at the entrance by the contracted security guard. Invitation only, he heard, despite wearing his badge around his neck. Minutes of embarrassment passed before someone authorized his entry, but the damage was already done, and no one there cared. At home, his mother noticed his distant look. "Son, are you eating well?" she asked, trying to pull some truth from him. Jeremias answered with a quick smile and everything's fine. She knew it wasn't. Sometimes the heaviest pain is the one you can't share. The weight didn't just come from direct actions, but from daily microaggressions, the kind that almost go unnoticed to those who don't live through them. The veiled comment, the top-to-bottom glance, the selective silence. Small stones that, when piled up, form a wall. Jeremias understood that racism wasn't just the open insult, but the silent set of closing doors. Disappearing opportunities and spaces that seemed to tolerate his presence only out of obligation. It was like walking through a minefield only he could see. Even so, he kept trying to fit in, adjusting his tone of voice, his words, his posture, wearing what he thought conveyed neutrality, but neutrality in that context would never be enough. There would always be someone who saw in him something that needed to be controlled. The routine of policing himself all the time came at a cost. The exhaustion wasn't just physical, it was emotional, mental. Even if no one said it out loud, Jeremias knew. To them, he wasn't just Jeremias. He was the sum of all the prejudices they carried. On an ordinary night, sitting on the edge of his bed, he realized he was starting to believe the distorted versions of himself. But he swallowed the thought, took a deep breath, and decided it still wasn't time to give in. The sentence came cold, like a blade. Your attitude is not aligned with the company's values. Jeremias stood still, trying to process what they really meant. Deep down, he already knew. It was the verdict, written little by little, in every sideways glance, in every silence that surrounded him. It was as if all the signs had been there, but he insisted on believing he could overcome them with hard work. In that moment, reality simply took over. He tried to argue, recalling the extra hours, the solutions he created, and the deadlines he met. But he received a cold stare and the phrase that cut deeper than the dismissal, "Don't make this about race." It was the denial not only of the problem, but of the very life experience he carried. It was as if they wanted to take away, along with his badge, his right to tell the truth. And at that moment, he realized there was no room for dialogue. The dismissal letter lay on the table without a single line acknowledging his effort. A generic text that could have been used for anyone, but for him, it carried the weight of years spent trying to prove his worth. He looked at the paper as one looks at a sentence already expected but still painful. He felt he wasn't just losing a job, but being erased from a story he helped build. And that hurt more than any lost paycheck. When he stood up, he realized he wouldn't be leaving alone. A security guard walked him to the door as if he were a thief. Each step seemed to echo in the silent hallway where some onlookers cast disguised glances, and others made no effort to hide their satisfaction. It was a public cut, a silent display that he was no longer welcome. The sound of his own footsteps was louder than anything else. Outside, the rain was pouring down. Jeremias had no umbrella, and the water ran down his face, mixing with the bitter heat of tears he tried to hold back. The cold wind bit at his skin, while the sound of the rain muffled even his thoughts. The city seemed grayer, as if it reflected the weight he carried inside, and each drop that fell seemed to push him further down. The badge, once a symbol of achievement, now burned in his pocket like cold iron. He thought of throwing it away, but something made him hold it tight, maybe as a reminder, maybe as silent proof of the humiliation. Simple objects sometimes carry more scars than people imagine. It was as if that small piece of plastic was the summary of everything he had lived there, and he knew he wouldn't forget. He kept walking along the sidewalk, the hem of his pants soaked and his shoes heavy with water. The wind pressed against his body as if the world wanted to test him once more. There was no clear destination, only the instinct to keep moving forward. Each step was driven by inertia and the desire to get away as quickly as possible. He was invisible to everyone, yet he felt every gaze cutting through his skin that day. Jeremias understood there are silent falls, the kind that make no noise and draw no attention. They simply sink, like a stone dropped into a deep lake. The silence around, however, is almost as cruel as the act that causes the fall. In that silence, it's easy to believe no one cares. But the truth is, sometimes it's at the bottom that the strength to resurface is born. Time went by, but the doors remained closed. Resumes sent received no reply. Interviews scheduled were canceled at the last minute. Jeremias began to feel that the silence of the phone was louder than any spoken no. Little by little, hope turned into a burden, and the burden became routine. The world seemed to have decided he no longer had a place. With no options, he began selling sweets at the traffic lights. At first, he carried a timid smile, trying to turn hardship into dignity. But one day, while offering his products, a car stopped. Inside, a former co-worker recognized him, looked away, and sped off. It was as if the past had crossed the street just to remind him of who he could no longer be. At home, the bills piled up on the table. A stack of papers seemed to grow faster than any possibility of payment. One day, the power was cut off, and darkness invaded the rooms like a cruel reminder that nothing was under control. Jeremias lit a candle, and in its faint glow, saw the shadow of a man who seemed to shrink a little more each day. The bedroom mirror became an enemy. He would get close, stare at his own face, and, in a sudden impulse, shout, "Why was I born this way?" The sound echoed off the walls, coming back to him as if someone else were shouting along. On the other side of the door, his mother cried quietly, without words to comfort him. Some pains don't fit inside advice. The rejection didn't just come from outside, it began to live inside him. Each refusal fed the voice telling him he wasn't enough, that it was no use trying. It was as if his own reflection confirmed what the world kept insisting on saying, and the more he looked, the less he recognized himself. Yet even in that emotional pit, a part of him still resisted. Small, almost extinguished, but alive. It was the spark that kept him from giving up completely, even when everything around him seemed to push him further down. He knew that, somehow, he would have to find a way back. The street was no longer just a place to pass through, it was where he sought his livelihood. The sound of cars, the smell of exhaust, and the cold of the early morning became his daily companions. Each sweet sold was a small victory, but also a painful reminder that he was far from where he had dreamed of being. In those silent nights, Jeremias began to understand that true abandonment is not when the world turns its back on you, but when you start to believe you deserve it. And it was this inner battle he needed to win before any other. The invitation came like a gesture of salvation. The wealthy cousin showed up saying he wanted to help and that there was a place for Jeremias in his company. With no other options, he accepted, trying to believe it could be a chance to start over. His heart carried suspicion, but also a thread of hope. After all, any job seemed better than nothing. Within the first days, he realized that opportunity came with a price. There was no contract, no formal hiring, no clear role. The tasks he was given had nothing to do with office work. They were domestic chores disguised as temporary help. Even so, Jeremiah stayed quiet and did everything with the dignity. He still had left. The cousin made sure to remind others of his situation. In casual conversations, he would throw out jokes. This one got fired for being too black. Imagine that. Laughter came easily, and Jeremiah forced himself to keep a neutral face. Inside, shame and anger piled up like water behind a dam. The humiliation was constant. Instead of receiving training or guidance to grow, he was handed menial tasks and comments that chipped away at his worth. The cousin's words didn't come alone. They carried condescending looks and calculated, meant to show who was in charge.
Nice.
It was a power game disguised as generosity. The bitterest moment came during a barbecue. Between beers, the cousin, laughing loudly, added the phrase he had repeated so many times. Black people need to know their place. The table burst into laughter. Jeremiah said nothing. He simply stood up, adjusted his shirt, and left without looking at anyone. He walked through the streets like a man fleeing a fire. There was nowhere to go, but he knew he couldn't return. The shame of facing his mother with yet another failure burned hotter than the cold wind of the night. He passed empty sidewalks, closed shops, and silent corners, feeling the weight of every step. He found a park bench and sat down, hugging himself for warmth. The night dragged on slowly, and the few sounds of the city felt distant. The loneliness he felt wasn't just physical, it was the absence of bonds, as if every tie had been cut at once. On that bench, Jeremiah understood that the worst betrayal doesn't come from those far away. It comes from those who know every scar and still choose to hurt you. The cold of the night was nothing compared to the cold growing inside. And in that darkness, he realized he would now have to walk alone. The next morning found Jeremiah still sitting on the park bench, his body sore from the cold and from the position he had slept in the night before. The first rays of sunlight brought a timid warmth but couldn't dispel the feeling of emptiness. It was in that moment that an elderly woman with gray hair and a kind gaze walked past him. She stopped, watched him for a few seconds. Can asked if he had already had breakfast. Not understanding her intention, he answered no. She smiled, gestured for him to follow her, and together they walked to a small shop on the corner. There, she placed in front of him a steaming cup of coffee and a simple roll of bread. While he ate, she simply observed, as if she knew the hunger went beyond his stomach. She didn't ask unnecessary questions, respecting his silence. Over time, Jeremiah discovered that this woman owned a small grocery store in the neighborhood. A widow with no children, she lived off her daily work and loyal customers. Even so, she offered him a corner in the back of the store where he could sleep and find shelter. She asked for nothing in return, only that he'd not give up on himself. It was a rare gesture, and for that, priceless. Gradually, he began to help out in the grocery store. At first, he arranged shelves and made small deliveries on foot. For the first time in a long while, he felt someone looking at him without filters or judgment. That simple trust reignited something he thought he had lost, the desire to believe in his own worth. One night, sitting in the makeshift room at the back of the store, Jeremiah picked up an old cell phone the woman had given him. She said it belonged to a distant son who no longer used it. With internet access, he started watching videos, reading articles, and finding free courses on sales, marketing, and entrepreneurship. He was discovering a world that had once seemed far out of reach. The days that followed were filled with study. In practice, he observed how the store owner dealt with suppliers, how she organized promotions, and how she kept customers coming back. He realized that even without great resources, there was a method there. And more importantly, he learned that you didn't need to wait for the perfect moment to start something. You needed to start with what you had. Inspired. He began thinking of ways to use that knowledge to create something of his own. He sketched ideas in an old notebook, scribbling plans and possible routes. It was like putting together a puzzle where each piece came from a past experience, including the painful ones. And, surprisingly, the pieces were starting to fit. The woman, noticing the spark in his eyes, began encouraging him more. She said he had fire in his eyes and needed to make sure no one put it out. That phrase echoed in his mind all day, reminding him that despite everything, there was still a living ember waiting to turn into a flame. And so, between simple shelves and a makeshift room, Jeremias began planting the first seeds of what would become his new beginning. There was no extra money, no guarantee of success. But there was something money couldn't buy, the belief that it was still possible to turn the game around. With the little he had, Jeremias decided to take a risk. He bought a used bicycle, strapped a backpack on his back, and began offering delivery services to local shop owners. At first, there were only a few orders a day, but each delivery was made with the care of someone who knew his name depended on it. The streets, once just the backdrop of his struggles, now became the field where he was building his comeback. His first regular client was a butcher. It needed to deliver goods to elderly residents in the neighborhood. Jeremias made the trips quickly, but didn't just drop things off. He helped put the groceries away, carried heavy bags, and asked if they needed anything else. This attention began to be noticed, and little by little, other shopkeepers started calling him. His reputation grew without him needing to advertise. Even so, fear was always present. The fear that something might go wrong, that this new chance would collapse like the ones before. His nights were filled with planning and insomnia, thinking of ways to keep the business alive. With each new client came the pressure not to disappoint, because he knew trust was something gained slowly and lost quickly. As demand increased, he realized the bicycle could no longer keep up. He began saving part of his earnings to invest in a motorcycle. It took months, but when he finally bought it, it felt like a leap forward. Now he could take on more orders, reach farther destinations, and that opened new possibilities. He also sought to learn more about organization and routes. He used free apps to map deliveries and save fuel. He watched videos on logistics, studied customer service, and wrote everything down. Each day, he was less improvising and more managing. The difference between surviving and running a business was starting to show. Despite the progress, the marks of the past still weighed on him. Jeremias often wondered if people trusted him for his work, or if they still saw him through the same eyes as before. This internal conflict made him work even harder, as if he had to prove every day that he deserved to be there. The physical exhaustion was great, but the emotional exhaustion was greater. Even so, partnerships kept growing. Small markets, pharmacies, and bakeries began relying on him to deliver to their customers. Shopkeepers supported each other, recommending his service to others. Without realizing it, Jeremias was creating a network, and that network was holding him up. The days were busy, but he felt something different. Purpose. Delivery wasn't just a package handed over, but a brick in the construction of something bigger. At every corner, at every door knocked, he felt he was stitching his story back together, piece by piece. And so, between scars and silent victories, a small empire was born, one made of wounds and strength. A business that hadn't come from a perfect plan, but from the need to survive. And perhaps for that reason, it carried in each delivery the mark of someone who had lost everything and yet chose to keep going. In 2 years, Jeremias was no longer just a lone delivery man. The bicycle was replaced by a motorcycle, then another, until the day he bought his first van. Each achievement was the result of long days, short nights, and calculated decisions. The business was no longer improvised, it was gaining structure. Now he wasn't just working. He was managing. He set up a small warehouse in the neighborhood, turning a simple space into a local logistics hub. There, young people from the community found their first job opportunities. Jeremias personally trained each one, teaching everything from route organization to the importance of treating every customer with respect. He didn't just want to create delivery workers. He wanted to create professionals. Every week, the operation grew. New clients appeared, including large companies that saw in Jeremias' service the agility and trust they were looking for. Ironically, the same doors that once shut in his face were now opening and inviting him in. But he never forgot the path he had taken and made sure no one working with him ever felt invisible. The impact on the community was clear. Young people who once saw no prospects now had jobs, learned about responsibility, and began to dream bigger. Jeremias invested in training, bought equipment, and ensured that everyone felt part of something greater. It was more than a job, it was a transformation project. Even with the growth, he remained humble. He still made deliveries from time to time, especially for longtime customers who had supported him from the beginning. It was his way of remembering where he came from and reinforcing that behind every package there was a story. These small actions strengthened client relationships and the company's reputation. Social media began to talk about him. Videos showing the team's work and customer testimonials spread, bringing even more attention to the business. Understood that beyond logistics, there was an emotional value to the service, delivering trust. And that couldn't be measured only in deadlines, but in relationships. With more resources, he invested in technology. He created his own system to manage orders, track deliveries, and optimize routes. This made the work more efficient and increased the capacity to handle large volumes. The company was starting to stand out not only for its human touch, but also for its innovation. Even with all the progress, fear still lingered. Jeremias knew how fragile the balance between success and failure could be. That's why he maintained discipline, managed his finances carefully, and avoided being dazzled. He didn't want to repeat past mistakes or forget that everything started with a bicycle and a will to survive. Deep down, he knew he was building something far greater than a business. It was a symbol of resilience, living proof that pain could be transformed into power. And with every new delivery, every young person trained, he felt that the name Jeremias could no longer be ignored. The day dawned differently. Jeremias, now the owner of a consolidated company, stood in front of the building where, years earlier, he had been humiliated and thrown out into the rain. There was no pain in his eyes anymore, only fire. In that moment, he realized he wasn't just buying a property. He was reclaiming a piece of his dignity. Upon entering, the hallway's smell still carried bitter memories, but now they were only distant echoes. Each step resonated with the weight of his triumph. Imagine the expressions of those who once said he wasn't fit to be there. This time, he was the one signing the papers and setting the rules. The building was renovated. The cold walls were replaced with vibrant colors and photos of the neighborhood that raised him. Right at the entrance, a shining sign displayed his company's name and his own. It was a clear statement. He no longer needed to ask for space. Now, he created spaces. On the day of the inauguration, the sidewalk was crowded. Former colleagues, trained youth, partner shopkeepers, and even strangers came to witness it. In the center of the crowd, a familiar figure, the lady who had taken him in when he had nothing. She wore the same warm smile, but now her eyes sparkled. With pride, Jeremias held the microphone with steady hands, though his heart beat like a drum. He took a deep breath and looked at the crowd. They said I was too black to be here. Today, it's exactly because of that I am, he declared, and his words thundered through the silence that followed. Applause broke the air. He spoke about perseverance, about turning pain into strength, and about never letting someone else's gaze define who you are. Without victimizing himself, he shared the wounds he carried and how each had become a foundation stone. The crowd, attentive, didn't want to miss a single word. When he cut the inauguration ribbon alongside the lady, the moment felt bigger than the celebration itself. It wasn't just about a business. It was about proving that you can win without giving up your identity. It's about showing that the impossible is, in truth, just a challenge in disguise. As people entered to explore the space, Jeremias stepped back for a moment and watched from afar. He knew this chapter wasn't the end of his story, but the beginning of a new cycle. The difference was that now, he wasn't starting from scratch. He was starting from the top, with deep roots. And if you've made it this far following this story, remember, your struggle can also turn into victory.
What feels like a limit
Today can become a stepping stone tomorrow. Don't let anyone define the size of your dream. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and keep learning how to truly and definitively transform your life.